Now, in 2015, the government created a new offence of drug driving, and that established various legal limits for certain drugs. One of those drugs was benzoylecgonine. Now, benzoylecgonine is a breakdown product of cocaine. Okay, so around 40% of cocaine is metabolized into benzoylecgonine via a process what's known as non-enzymatic demethylation. Not that really means much, but what's important to know is that benzoylecgonine is going to stay in your system for a lot longer than cocaine will. Cocaine is a very fast-acting drug. So within 5 hours, it's completely removed from your system, 5 hours following consumption. But of course, benzoylecgonine is what's left over. And there's a separate legal limit in place for benzoylecgonine, 50 micrograms. So the legal limit for cocaine is 10, the legal limit for benzoylecgonine is 50 micrograms. There's always a couple of things to check with benzoylecgonine. The first question I would usually ask anyone who is suspected of having committed a drug driving offence is, what medication do you take? Because there are certain types of medication that, whilst not identical, may be very similar in structure to benzoylecgonine. They could be antidepressant medication, benzodiazepine medications that to a less experienced eye, a less experienced analyst or lab worker, may appear to be benzoylecgonine when in fact it's some other drug, some other substance. Now, of course, forensic results that are generated by labs should be what they call peer reviewed, meaning a more experienced analyst or an analyst with the same qualifications has to review that report to confirm that those results are accurate. But we've had a number of labs recently, those that I won't name, that weren't correctly peer reviewing, meaning you've got an inexperienced or a less experienced lab analyst who's generating results for use in criminal proceedings, and those results aren't being checked by anybody, by a supervisor, by a forensic scientist, by somebody who is more qualified to do that. They're not being checked. Those results are being given to the police, people are being charged and no doubt convicted of drug driving. Now, you'll also find that benzoylecgonine exists in greater amounts than most other drugs. Now, because of the conversion between benzoylecgonine and cocaine, benzoylecgonine can continue to develop within a sample once that sample has been taken from you. And so the cocaine levels, if any, will drop and the benzoylecgonine levels will increase. So when the sample is taken from you, you may have in your body or in your blood less than the legal limit worth of benzoylecgonine, less than 50 micrograms. But at the time the sample is finally tested by the lab, that proportion, that quantity of benzoylecgonine has increased, which has then pushed you above the legal limit. And that's always a huge problem, of course, because you're then being unfairly charged with drug driving. And now there's various factors that can affect the rate at which benzoylecgonine will break down, such as storage, the type of conditions or the type of environment that that sample is stored in at the police station. Most police stations don't have dedicated forensic fridges to store forensic samples. And I'm not joking when I say we've had cases where they've stored them next to the tuna butties which they'll have for lunch. So they have to store forensic samples in an appropriate environment. There was a report released very recently by the HM Inspectorate for police stations, and that advised amongst other things, that forensic samples from a police station be processed onwards within 1 week. Now, when they process a sample of blood onto an independent lab, they don't just stick it in the post, of course. They have to call a courier to the police station, and that's an expensive process. And what we've had in the past, and even very recently, is where the individual in charge of that process, the officer at the police station, he won't call that courier daily because of the cost involved. He'll let the samples build up over the month, and at the end of the month, the courier gets called to the police station and he takes those samples in bulk, and that saves on huge cost for the police. But it also means potentially that your blood samples stayed at the police station for much longer than it should have done in unsuitable conditions, which of course affects the conversion between cocaine and benzoylecgonine. It increases the level of benzoylecgonine where it's not stored in a stable or a suitable environment. So alongside the standard evidence that's produced by the prosecution service, and I've discussed SFR1 reports in a separate video, we also want to try and get hold of continuity information, whether the police can provide logs that are signed by officers, whether they have receipts from couriers that have come to collect that sample, dates and times when that happened, is it signed, is it verified, is it authenticated, and that too causes a huge headache for the police and the prosecution service. But in most circumstances, particularly following the guidance that was issued recently by the forensic science regulator, you are able to gain access to that information. You have every right to see it. Now, the final thing to check with any benzoylecgonine drug driving case are certified reference materials, what we call certified reference materials. Now, all the labs that conduct this type of work for the police have to use certified reference materials to provide calibration standards for quality control. What that means is when they test a sample of blood for benzoylecgonine, they have to calibrate that equipment within certain parameters. They have to appreciate that benzoylecgonine, for example, exists in much greater quantities than what you might find with cocaine or with THC, or with most other drugs. Benzoylecgonine is usually right up there. And when they calibrate that equipment and calibrate those instruments, they have to appreciate that fact. So they have to set upper and lower detection limits, and they have to set up their equipment within those parameters. Now, if that result generated by the lab are outside of those calibration standards, then that cannot be considered an accurate reading. And I've had results given to me by the prosecution that have been in excess of 400, 500, 600, sometimes in excess of 1,000, 2,000 micrograms of benzoylecgonine, and that's way beyond the calibration standards. In other words, a result like that simply couldn't be a calibrated, or it couldn't be a certified result, because it's outside of the range at which those instruments are set up to test. So again, calibration standards, the quality control, and the lab's use of certified reference materials, again, absolutely important to check with benzoylecgonine cases. So if you want to discuss any more about benzoylecgonine, of course there's an awful lot we haven't touched upon, then please get in contact. Happy to discuss that with you, happy to have a chat in as much detail as is necessary. There's also a separate video I think I mentioned about streamlined forensic reports, and that may well be useful if it is a benzoylecgonine case.